In the dead of night, without warning, Prince William made the move that no one saw coming. He gathered Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and walked them out of the palace walls. A departure so sudden, so deliberate, it left even the closest aides stunned. Why would the heir to the throne abandon the palace at its most critical hour? The silence of the palace corridors that evening was broken only by the soft shuffle of hurried footsteps and the faint murmur of startled whispers. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire. William, the future king, had chosen to leave. Not for an event, not for an overseas tour, but permanently. The symbolism was undeniable. For centuries, the palace had stood as both fortress and prison for the royals, a place of power, yet also of suffocating tradition. William's quiet departure was more than just a relocation. It was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that he would no longer be bound by the chains of expectation that had weighed down every monarch before him. For the stunned palace staff, it was a betrayal and a liberation all at once. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to the Windsor household, drilled into routine, sworn into secrecy, and yet none of them had anticipated this. Not a whisper of warning, not a shadow of suspicion. The decision had been made in silence, executed with precision, and carried out in secrecy. The aides left behind exchanged bewildered glances as the reality sank in. Their prince, the very embodiment of continuity, had broken the unspoken pact of duty. By dawn, the media was ablaze. Headlines screamed across front pages. Commentators speculated in hushed but frantic tones. And social media swelled with outrage, admiration, and confusion. Some called it rebellion, others a family emergency, and still others whispered that this was the first step toward abdication. Was William protecting his children, or was he rejecting his father's reign? Was this a man acting as a father first and heir second? Or was it something far more dangerous, a crack in the monarchy itself? But underneath the frenzy lay a darker truth. This was not just a shocking walkout. It was the first time in modern monarchy history that a direct heir had staged such a deliberate, public break. It wasn't exile forced upon him, nor scandal uncovered by the press. This was a conscious choice, a refusal to play by the rules any longer. William was not running away. He was stepping into uncharted territory, forcing the nation to confront questions it had never dared to ask. And yet, as the frenzy deepened, so too did the silence from inside the palace. No statements were issued, no explanations offered. Courtiers scrambled to manage the optics, but the damage was already done. The image of William walking away, his family in tow, spoke louder than any carefully crafted press release could. It was an image that pierced the veil of the monarchy's polished facade, laying bare the fractures within. But this was no ordinary family outing. This was the eruption of decades of silence. And behind William's decision was a storm brewing deep within the royal walls. What would drive a son to defy his father, the King of England? The answer lies in years of silent resentment, secret clashes, and an unspoken war between duty and heart. From the moment Charles ascended the throne, he carried with him a clear vision for his reign, and within that vision was an expectation that William would stand as the flawless heir, polished, compliant, and unquestioning. To the outside world, it seemed simple. William, the loyal son, destined to inherit the crown. But behind the gilded walls, the cracks widened with every passing month. For William, the role of the perfect heir was not just a burden. It was a prison. Charles's reign, shaped by decades of patience and struggle, was one he guarded fiercely. And yet, his loyalty was often directed less at his son and more at his wife, Camilla. William, who had carried the memory of his mother like a torch through years of public scrutiny, felt eclipsed by the very woman who had once been a shadow in his childhood. Every time Charles deferred to Camilla's counsel over his own son's resentment, carved itself deeper into William's heart. To the world, Camilla was the queen consort. But to William, she was the barrier between himself and the fatherly support he had always longed for. Disagreements soon turned into heated disputes. Behind closed doors, voices were raised, tempers flared, and the atmosphere grew toxic. William pushed for a monarchy that was modern, transparent, closer to the people. Yet, Charles held to a vision rooted in tradition and control. Whenever William argued for change, his father would cut him down with a cold reminder of his place. "Your time will come," But it is not now. The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they reduced William to little more than a placeholder in the grand design. Caught in the crossfire was Catherine. She had once hoped to be the bridge between father and son, soothing their clashes with patience and understanding. Yet more often, she found herself torn in silence, watching her husband's frustration mount as Charles dismissed his ideas. William, who had once leaned on Catherine's calm wisdom, now felt his anger rising even in her presence. She knew better than anyone how deeply he felt the shadow of his mother, and how unbearable it was for him to see history repeat itself, his father's loyalty once again belonging to someone other than his own blood. Rumors began to leak through the walls of secrecy. Whispers that William's calls for reform were being ignored. Whispers that Charles laughed off his son's warnings about a monarchy losing touch with its people. To some in the inner circle, it was only a matter of time before the simmering tension boiled over into open conflict. And then came the breaking point, the moment that transformed quiet discontent into open rebellion. In a dispute where Camilla's opinion clashed with William's, Charles publicly sided with his queen. What could have been a private disagreement turned into a humiliation. William, stripped of dignity before courtiers, was left with no illusion about his place in the eyes of his father. It was in that moment that something hardened within him. The son, who had been groomed to wait, to obey, to endure, finally snapped. His departure from the palace was not born in a single night. It was forged in these years of silence, of rejection, of humiliation. But if William's rift with his father set the fire, it was Queen Camilla's influence that fanned the flames into a raging inferno. Camilla was never meant to be just a stepmother. To William, she became something far more dangerous, an obstacle to his vision of the crown. What began as an uneasy coexistence slowly turned into a cold and calculated rivalry. One played not on open battlefields, but in whispers, gestures, and influence that seeped through every corner of the palace. Camilla's presence, once carefully managed, began to grow unchecked. She was no longer merely a companion to Charles, but a voice in state matters, an advisor in family disputes, and a shadow looming over decisions that should have belonged to the heir himself. William watched with unease as her influence expanded, not because she demanded it loudly, but because she wielded it quietly, with the skill of someone who knew how to bend a court to her will. The shift became clearer when her family started to be ushered into royal circles with a prominence that alarmed William and Catherine. Camilla's grandchildren, once distant figures, were suddenly visible at key events, their importance subtly elevated as though they were being woven into the very fabric of the monarchy. For William, this was more than favoritism. It was the rewriting of a future he had been raised to embody. Catherine shared his unease. Together, they exchanged looks of dismay as Charles deferred more and more to Camilla, granting her requests and indulging her vision of a legacy that had little to do with the Windsor bloodline. Behind closed doors, the tensions grew impossible to ignore. Heated debates broke out, not about matters of governance or foreign policy, but about how the public saw Camilla. William, who carried the weight of Diana's memory, argued that the monarchy could not afford to elevate a figure still controversial in the public eye. But Charles would not yield. Each time William raised the concern, Charles defended his wife with unwavering loyalty, even at the expense of his son's standing. The message was clear. Camilla's image was not to be challenged, and William's objections would be met with silence, dismissal, or worse, rebuke. The bitterness reached beyond the private chambers into the very heart of public life. Camilla, with her sharp instinct for timing, began to subtly undermine Catherine at events. A misplaced comment here, a cutting remark there. Moments designed to remind the Duchess of Cambridge that she was not the undisputed queen-in-waiting, but merely another piece in a game Camilla had mastered. Catherine bore it with grace, but William felt every slight as if it were a dagger. The woman who had already haunted his childhood was now encroaching on his wife's dignity, reshaping not only the palace, but the emotional core of his family. It was then that the realization struck him with devastating force. The monarchy was no longer being built around his mother's memory, nor even his father's reign. It was being restructured around Camilla's legacy. She was embedding herself into the narrative of the crown, not as a temporary consort, but as a permanent force. The future that Diana had dreamed for her son was slipping away, replaced by a version of monarchy molded in Camilla's image. For William, this was not just betrayal. It was war, silent and suffocating. waged in the halls where he was meant to feel most secure. And then came the moment that shattered William's patience, an insult so sharp it forced him to act. Every royal scandal has its breaking point, and this one came during a gathering where one whispered remark broke the heir's silence forever. What began as an evening meant to showcase unity quickly unraveled into an unforgettable confrontation. The palace dinner had gathered senior royals, close advisors, and select family members around a table where every gesture carried meaning. Every word could echo into headlines. It was there, amid the formalities and forced smiles, that Camilla's tongue slipped with a venom that no one expected. With a smirk and a casual cruelty sharpened over decades, she dismissed Diana's legacy in a single remark. To most, it might have seemed like a passing jest, but to William, it was a blade twisting into an old wound that had never healed. Catherine, seated nearby, felt the sting just as sharply. For years, she had carried the quiet dignity of Diana's memory, often measured against her image in ways that were both flattering and cruel. To hear Camilla reduce Diana's impact to a footnote, framed as a joke about royal titles, was devastating. Catherine's composure cracked for a fleeting second, her face betraying the hurt that words alone could not mask. And in that instant, William's fury ignited not only at the insult to his mother, but at the pain inflicted upon his wife. What made it worse was that his children were there, not directly at the table but close enough to hear. George, curious and watchful, caught the remark with the sharp ears of youth. Charlotte, too, her eyes widening, understood more than anyone thought. And Louis, though younger, sensed the tension, the shift in the room's energy. For William, the sight of their innocent faces, registering the cruelty, was unbearable. He had vowed they would never suffer the scars he carried. And yet, here it was, history poisoning the next generation. When William turned to his father, expecting at the very least a stern rebuke, what he received instead was silence. Charles refused to reprimand Camilla. His eyes averted, his lips pressed together. He chose loyalty to his wife, over the dignity of his son, over the legacy of the woman whose memory still lived in millions of hearts. That silence cut deeper than Camilla's words. It was the ultimate betrayal, a confirmation that William stood alone in defending Diana's honor and his family's future. The room fell still. The conversation stopped. Forks suspended mid-air, and the weight of unspoken tension filled the hall. William rose from his seat, his chair scraping against the polished floor, and stormed out. The heavy doors closed behind him, leaving silence so profound it was deafening. For those left behind, it was a moment frozen in time. For William, it was the final fracture in a bond already shattered. Within 24 hours, the decision was made. No more private pleas, no more enduring slights in silence. The heir to the throne would remove himself and his family from the very place that had become both a gilded prison and battleground. It was not a retreat, it was an act of rebellion. The palace had crossed a line, and William would no longer endure its poisons. But where could the heir to the throne take his family when leaving the palace meant abandoning centuries of royal safety? The nation held its breath. Where did William and Catherine take their children? The answer was as shocking as the departure itself. In the aftermath of their midnight walk from the palace, speculations surged. Was this a retreat abroad? A desperate bid for freedom, far from London's suffocating corridors? Or was it a carefully orchestrated exile, signaling a deeper rift that could never be healed? The truth was far more deliberate and far more symbolic. William had not left blindly. In the weeks leading up to the eruption, he had quietly secured a private estate, shielded from public eyes and entirely unknown to the press. This was no accident of impulse. It was the act of a man who had prepared for the moment when escape would be his only option. The estate itself carried a meaning that cut deeper than the bricks and land it rested on. It represented a breakaway from the golden cage of tradition, a place chosen not for pomp, but for peace. For centuries, heirs to the throne had been bound within the walls of royal residences, watched, guarded, suffocated by duty. But William's decision struck against that very order. By stepping outside those walls, he symbolically dismantled the idea that a future king must live under constant surveillance, shackled by history. His move was not just geographical, it was ideological. A statement that the crown could no longer claim absolute ownership of his life or his family. Inside the palace, panic set in as soon as the truth became clear. Security, blindsided and scrambling, raced to cover the breach. Convoys were deployed, protocols rewritten on the spot, but the secrecy did not last. Within hours, whispers began to leak from corners of the press corps too sharp to be silenced. Journalists caught wind of movement, their sources feeding fragments of information that pieced together into a storm. By the time the first hints surfaced in print, helicopters were already circling above countryside estates, chasing shadows in hopes of capturing the first definitive glimpse of William's safe haven. The desperation to expose his refuge only heightened the intrigue, amplifying the sense of rebellion that clung to every detail of the story. The public reaction was electric. For some, it looked like abdication in disguise, a quiet announcement that William no longer wished to bear the weight of monarchy. Others framed it as outright rebellion, the heir turning his back on a crown that had demanded too much and given too little. Still others whispered of exile, of a son banished for daring to confront the king and his queen. Whatever the interpretation, one fact was undeniable. This was unprecedented. No heir in modern history had dared such a move, and the silence from the palace only deepened the sense that something irreversible had begun. And then, the final revelation surfaced. The estate William chose had ties that could not be ignored. It was not simply a place of safety. It was a place tied to Diana. Every path, every stone carried echoes of the woman who had suffered under the crown's weight, and who had dreamed of freedom for her children. By taking his family there, William sent a message louder than any speech could deliver. He was aligning himself not with the legacy of the monarchy, but with the memory of his mother. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a reminder that Diana's voice, though silenced years ago, still spoke through him. But the palace would not let this humiliation go unanswered, and soon a counter-narrative emerged to reclaim control. As news broke, courtiers scrambled. The monarchy could not afford to appear fractured, and yet, William's actions had exposed the deepest fault lines. The press office worked overtime, spinning a story that painted the move as nothing more than a temporary arrangement, a matter of privacy and rest, rather than rebellion. Carefully chosen words were drafted, emphasizing family unity, promising that nothing had changed within the House of Windsor. But the public was not convinced. Behind those polished statements lay chaos, and the world could see it. At the center of it all was King Charles, torn between protecting his son and defending his wife. He understood the symbolism of William's departure. The people saw it as a rejection of his reign, a public condemnation of his choices. To stand by, William would mean undermining Camilla, whose presence had already fueled division. To defend Camilla would mean alienating the heir, risking the very stability of the succession. Charles, a man who had waited decades for the crown, now found himself forced into an impossible balancing act. And in his hesitation, the cracks widened further. Leaked memos from within the palace revealed the true extent of the panic. Communications staff described William's departure as a severe reputational threat. Words like crisis management and containment circulated through corridors where once only ceremonial language had reigned. Advisors debated whether to downplay William's absence or confront it head-on. Every draft of every statement was weighed not just for its meaning, but for the message it sent to a public already questioning the monarchy's purpose. Each attempt at reassurance only deepened the sense that something catastrophic had unfolded within the family. The royal household itself was divided. Some staff felt their loyalty belonged to the king, believing that protecting the crown meant defending Charles and Camilla at all costs. Others, however, whispered their sympathy for William, convinced that his actions were those of a man finally standing up for truth and for his children. Servants, who once moved silently through the halls, now exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that even their allegiance might be tested in a feud that was no longer private. And with the fractures came the resurfacing of old rivalries. Senior royals who had long remained in the background began maneuvering for influence, seizing on William's departure as an opportunity to strengthen their own standing. The palace, once carefully managed as a symbol of unity, now looked more like a battlefield where ambition, resentment, and fear collided in secret. Every conversation seemed laced with suspicion. Every decision carried the weight of potential scandal. The speculation outside grew louder with each passing day. Commentators began to question whether this was more than a family dispute. Could the monarchy itself be facing a constitutional crisis? If the heir to the throne openly rejected palace authority, how long before Parliament intervened? or before public opinion pushed for drastic reform. The idea, once unthinkable, now danced dangerously close to reality. The very foundation of the crown seemed less certain, with each headline, with each leak, with each whisper of rebellion. But the real battle wasn't about press releases or appearances, it was about the children, and what future they would inherit. At the heart of William's rebellion wasn't power or titles, it was the protection of his children, the next generation of Windsors. For years, he had watched with growing unease, as George, barely old enough to understand the weight of his surname, was pulled into the intricate games of palace politics. The boy's presence at events was carefully choreographed, his every gesture dissected by courtiers eager to mold him into a symbol rather than allow him to remain a child. William saw in his son's eyes the same burden he once carried, the crushing awareness that life was no longer his own. That haunting familiarity ignited a resolve within William to break the cycle, to ensure George would never become a pawn to an institution that had already claimed so much of his family. Charlotte, too, was caught in the storm. While the world admired her composure and spark, within the palace she was often wielded as a counterpoint, a figure used to project unity and soften the image of a monarchy under fire. Every smile, every wave, every carefully planned photograph was part of a strategy that had little to do with who she truly was. For William and Catherine, it was intolerable. Their daughter was not a shield for others' mistakes, nor a distraction from scandals. They could see how easily her childhood could be consumed by the crown's insatiable hunger for image. Protecting Charlotte's individuality became as urgent as shielding George from premature duty. And then there was Louis, the youngest, still innocent, still untouched by the machinery that had already begun shaping his siblings. His laughter, his curiosity, his unfiltered joy stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing around him. William clung to that innocence like a lifeline, determined that it would not be corrupted by the same forces that had stolen his own carefree youth. Louis symbolized what was still pure and unbroken in his family, and William swore that no crown, no courtier, no whisper of politics would take that from him. Catherine's voice was just as strong, echoing the same fear and determination. She reminded William that while he carried his mother's scars, she carried the responsibility of preventing new ones. Catherine had always understood the toll of royal life, but now she demanded a line be drawn. The children must come first. Shielding them from trauma was not a choice. It was a duty greater than any crown could impose. Together, she and William built a wall of resolve, refusing to let history repeat itself. It was in this spirit that William made his vow, a declaration whispered within the safety of their new refuge, but resounding like thunder in his heart. They will not suffer as my mother did. It was more than a promise to his children. It was a statement of defiance to the monarchy itself. His rebellion was not against tradition, nor against his father, but against the cycle of suffering that had haunted Diana and now threatened her grandchildren. The public, too, saw the humanity in his stand. Families across Britain recognized the struggle of a father determined to protect his children from forces greater than himself. For once, William was not seen as heir, prince, or future king, but as every father fighting to give his children the chance to live free of the ghosts that had consumed his own childhood. But while William fought to protect his children, the crown's machinery moved relentlessly forward toward a confrontation no one could avoid. Britain awoke to a monarchy split in two. On one side stood King Charles and Camilla. On the other, William, Catherine, and the children are symbols of hope and rebellion. The air was charged with tension, the kind that doesn't just divide families, but threatens to fracture an entire nation. Crowds began to form outside landmarks and royal residences, carrying signs and chanting words of support for William. For many, he embodied a kind of authenticity the monarchy had long since lost. A father willing to protect his family, a man willing to stand against tradition when tradition itself had turned poisonous. The sight of thousands rallying, not for the king, but for the heir who had walked away, was a moment that would forever mark this chapter in royal history. But the nation was not unanimous. Older royalists, those who had lived through the reign of Elizabeth and revered the weight of continuity, condemned William's actions as reckless, selfish, even dangerous. To them, the monarchy was not a family squabble. It was the backbone of Britain, and his decision to turn his back on the palace felt like betrayal. They saw him not as a protector of children, but as a destabilizer of the crown. The rift between generations widened, leaving the monarchy's traditional base of support uneasy and disillusioned. The global media, ever hungry for drama, seized the story with both hands. In America, William and Catherine were hailed as reformers, brave enough to carve a new path. In Europe, newspapers dissected the fracture as a constitutional threat. Across the Commonwealth, commentators debated whether this was the beginning of the end for the monarchy itself. The story was no longer confined to British tabloids. It had become an international spectacle, a crisis that blurred the line between private rebellion and public upheaval. Within the corridors of power, whispers grew louder. Parliament, cautious but alert, began murmuring about intervention. Questions surfaced in quiet committee rooms about the constitutional implications of an heir rejecting the crown's authority. Some suggested mediation, others questioned whether Charles could remain strong enough to withstand both personal and public discontent. The very system that had for centuries protected the monarchy was now being asked whether it should step in to contain it. The unease seeped into every corner of government, blurring politics and tradition in a way that few had dared imagine. And at the center of it all was Charles himself, trapped in silent agony. He was torn between his duty to protect the wife he had fought so hard to legitimize and the son he had raised to inherit the throne. He loved William, of that there was no doubt, but every choice he made seemed to drive them further apart. Loyalty to Camilla meant betrayal of his son. Siding with William would unravel the fragile stability of his reign. For a man who had waited a lifetime for the crown, the moment it finally rested on his head was now tainted by division that no ceremony could conceal. The monarchy's future was no longer secure. What had once been a steady, unquestioned institution now felt fragile, its fate uncertain. Would it endure this storm, reshaping itself to survive another generation? Or would William's defiance prove to be the first domino in a collapse too long delayed? That question echoed in every household, in every paper, in every whispered conversation about the future of the crown. And then, just as the storm reached its height, William himself broke his silence with words that stunned even his fiercest critics. Standing before cameras, with Catherine by his side, William finally spoke, and his words will echo through history. After days of speculation, silence, and mounting tension, the heir to the throne broke the wall of secrecy. His voice steady but charged with emotion. He framed his family's departure not as a rejection of duty, but as a stand for something greater: truth and family. "I will not allow my children to grow within walls that suffocate rather than protect," he declared, his words cutting through the noise of speculation with a clarity that could not be ignored. In that moment, William was no longer simply the Prince of Wales. He was a man taking his destiny into his own hands. The weight of his speech only grew as he invoked the name that still lingered in every conversation, every whispered headline: Diana. William spoke of his mother not as a figure of the past, but as a presence that still guided him. "My mother taught me that love must outweigh duty, and truth must always be stronger than fear." The mention of her name brought tears to those watching, both in the crowd and across the nation. It was not just a son remembering his mother. It was the heir reminding the world of a wound the monarchy had never healed, and perhaps never would. But this was not merely about memory. It was also a warning. William spoke of the shadows of the past, urging that they should not be allowed to rule the present. It was a statement laced with defiance, a clear refusal to let the mistakes that had destroyed Diana's life dictate the lives of his children. He was signaling that the monarchy, in its current form, was on trial, not just in the eyes of the nation, but in the judgment of history. The audience, riveted and unsettled, knew he was speaking not only of the institution, but of Camilla herself, though her name never passed his lips. Beside him, Catherine's silence was just as powerful as William's words. Her calm, unwavering presence was more than symbolic. It was confirmation that this was not just William's rebellion, but a united stand. Her eyes, her posture, her stillness amplified his message without a single syllable spoken. Together they stood not as husband and wife alone, but as a partnership ready to chart a new course, even if it meant defying centuries of expectation. And then, for a brief moment, the children appeared. George, Charlotte, and Louis stepped into the spotlight, not as heirs in waiting, but as children whose future William had just vowed to protect. Their presence was fleeting, but its symbolism was undeniable. They were the new dawn, the reason for this defiance, the hope that something better could rise from the ashes of tradition. It was as though William was offering a vision of what the monarchy could be, human, real, and unbound from the chains of old rivalries. When his words ended, Britain was left with a haunting question. Had the heir just declared independence from the monarchy itself? The silence that followed was heavy, as if the entire nation was holding its breath. Supporters saw courage, critics saw recklessness, but none could deny the magnitude of what had just been said. William had torn open the curtain and forced the world to look at what lay behind it. And as the cameras cut, one truth became undeniable. Nothing in the monarchy would ever be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.